We are going to talk about, as you know from the title, the role of evidence in solutions journalism. We're going to talk about when we describe evidence, what it is exactly, and certainly why it's important, how we evaluate it, analyze it, use it in solutions reporting. We'll have one breakout exercise and group exercise as well, kind of get you thinking more about evidence and data. And while we will talk about data, it's important to know this is not a statistics session. We will not be using Greek letters or doing advanced programming and the like. I can tell you, the basics of data literacy for the data side of evidence will carry you a pretty far way. There's great stuff that can be done with sort of advanced programming and the like, but if you've got the basics of a spreadsheet, there's a lot you can do with data-based evidence, and certainly with data and solutions reporting. So no, not a computer science class, instead kind of a focus on understanding, the role and the use of evidence in solutions reporting. We'll have time for questions, but certainly feel free to put questions in the chat, as well as, if you like, I know Nicole is going to be monitoring that, and we'll toss out questions of her own and questions of yours as time goes on. And so let me start sharing my screen and kind of get this rolling. Right.
Oh, and also just before we start, we want this to definitely be a conversation, but just while we're recording, if you can mute your microphone during the presentation, and then feel free to unmute to ask a question.
All right. Scoot that up a little. There we go. All right, so this is the main slide. This will also be the last slide. So if you want to grab some email addresses, and I can say as hosts, if you go to the participants, you can actually mute folks if they're on a phone and may not realize that. Hang on, apparently I can't do that. All right, good. I think we're good now. All right, sorry about that. Let me move on. I always like to start in any session about solutions reporting is just kind of a reminder of the basics of what it is, and then talk about sort of how it ties in with evidence. So solutions journalism is, you can see here, rigorous and compelling reporting about responses to social problems. And kind of all of the words in this description are important. I've always liked this description from one of our co-founders, as you can see. All the words here, solution journalism is rigorous, right? This isn't sort of about, taking anyone's word for it that something is working. It's sort of the same sort of hard-nosed reporting, and skepticism that you would apply to any story certainly applies in full force with a solution story. It calls on your investigative skills to really kind of dig in and see how exactly is this, for some reason it says I'm in the waiting room, interesting. Investigate how a response is working. Is it really having the desired effect? And it calls for a critical eye, right? Again, not about taking someone's word for it, but really doing your due diligence there, and giving a serious look into how a response was implemented, how it's working, and the like. And so this rigorous and compelling reporting, and I would, I guess, add an adjective to that, and sort of say, rigorous, compelling, and evidence-based, reporting about responses to problems. That evidence-based element is really, really important in solutions work. It's really what kind of sets solutions journalism apart. It's what keeps, Sojo kind of safely away from fluff or public relations or sort of advocacy. So that, reliance on evidence, really kind of the heart of solutions journalism. So let's talk about that a little more deeply, and get the question why evidence is important. This question, and actually the next question we're going to see, may seem self-evident, but it's actually important to kind of dive in there and really, think about these questions. So why evidence is important. As I said, it's kind of the heart of solutions journalism. It's what sets true solutions work apart, from a story that might merely report an untested theory. If someone has what they think is a good idea, and maybe it'll work and maybe it won't. Well, that's not solutions reporting. We're looking for some real evidence that a response, is working or will likely work. Good intentions, sort of, that's not enough. We don't want stories that simply guess that, hey, things will work out well. We have our fingers crossed, the officials assure us, this should take care of that problem. That's not a solution story. That's not the degree of evidence we're looking for. And very importantly, evidence gets you away from simply reporting a story with some individual or some group's claims of a policy's value. People are often vested in the things that they promote, and may offer all sorts of exciting claims about what an absolute game changer this idea is. And write that story, and you run the risk of sort of being taken in by someone's public relations pitch. That doesn't make for a strong solution story, doesn't make for a solution story at all, frankly. But evidence is what elevates a good story above kind of any of these, potential issues here. All right, so I want to actually, let me give an example of, a story that did not have that evidence, that didn't rise to a solution story, but really should have. This is a program in Michigan in the United States, and put on by Health West. You see at that bottom sentence there, Health West officials, are hoping that this idea will empower teens who are struggling, drive down the number of youth. They're sort of hoping for that. But if you look in the paragraph above it, they say it's, just the second program in the state. Well, a good solutions reporter would think, okay, how has that worked out so far? And I thought this story really missed an opportunity to turn this into a solution story, saying, maybe explain, it's only been done in one other place in the state, but here's what the outcome of that program looks like here. Instead, this story simply, mentioned, hey, you know what, it's been done before in the state, and folks are hoping it's going to work out this time. I think really sort of missed an opportunity there to take this farther and kind of elevate this story and tell readers something important. Well, what's the track record for this? Should I be excited about this? Is this something that I'm glad, my state is investing resources in? That's the sort of, assistance, the sort of audience help that a good solution story has that I think is kind of lacking in this story. All right, this may feel a little backwards from here. I've just sort of made a big pitch for the importance of evidence, but I want to now go back and explore what exactly do we mean by evidence. What kind of counts as evidence? This is sometimes a word, if you think about it in your own minds right now, if I were to ask, so what do we mean by evidence? It's one of those words that can be hard to define without actually using the word. Evidence is evidence that, it's like, nope. So let's see if we can come up with a definition that doesn't simply, repeat the word. For me, starting, it is a numerical or a descriptive indication of impact, right? It is something that you can show your audience that, a particular incident or intervention or response or policy had some impact. And certainly for solutions reporting, evidence works as elements that help support the idea that something is working. It's the way we sort of convince ourselves, convince our editors, convince our audience that something is having the desired effect. And there are two main types. Imagine you know this, kind of quantitative evidence and qualitative evidence. Quantitative being more on the statistical, number side, and qualitative, more in descriptive, impressionistic opinions, and the like. And both are important. Quantitative kind of helps us describe if something is having an effect, how big an effect, how big a change did this have? Also, how broad an impact did it have? How wide, an area did it reach? So, quantitative evidence, terrific in both, both breadth and depth of the impact of a response. And then the qualitative, important getting kind of that human element in there. How do people feel about something? What's their description of what's going on there? So we often think of quantitative evidence and data as sort of, cleaner. It's like it's you can see it went from 20 to 50. That seems cleaner than so and so felt better about it. But really both kind of are important. I mean, truthfully, if you're kind of honest with data, it's probably more compelling to say, after this policy went into effect, the number of homeless individuals dropped by 30% in our community, or this province has twice the rate of vaccination, compared to this other province over here. Certainly easy to show that, with graphs. That's very, very compelling. But again, qualitative evidence is what sort of adds humanity to your reporting, right? I mean, after all, we don't write stories just about numbers. It's the people behind those numbers that sort of really matter, or the heart of what we're trying to do here. So including that qualitative evidence, the thoughts and experiences of those who are involved, interviews with others to get their impressions, maybe some survey data, expert opinions on that. It's more anecdotal, more personal, not as systemic, I guess, as quantitative data, but again, really important, and they pair really well together. That quantitative evidence and data can really cleanly and efficiently kind of make the case that something has had a desired effect. But then that qualitative evidence can sort of elevate the humanity of your story. I mean, after all, if we're writing about efforts to make things better, then hearing how people feel about that response, how it impacts them, that's really important too. So let me give you some examples.
Oh, Matthew?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
I just had one question about something on this slide also that's come up with some of our solutions journalism stories at Transitions. Does the evidence have to always show that something is working, or what's kind of the approach if the evidence might be kind of inconclusive, or maybe show that it's not as effective? Can it still be a solution story?
It can be, yeah. And we'll sort of talk later about, what do we do when we have limited evidence? But this is a great point. I'm glad you brought this up at this stage. not every story has just absolutely perfect, incontrovertible evidence around it. But it can still be a solution story, including one of the really important elements of solutions journalism, which is being very transparent about the limitations of a story. So it's important. We'll talk about some of this later. We tell our readers what we know, and we tell them what we don't know, and we tell them what might be lacking in this. So yes, if you certainly, if something is kind of early on and there is somewhat limited evidence, it isn't, well, you know what, I have no choice, I'm just going to have to come back in a couple of years and see how things worked out. One, if there's absolutely no evidence, it's a brand new policy, that can be a decent story. It may not be a solution story. It doesn't mean no, I can't write about this new policy until 18 months later. But for a solution story, if there is some evidence, you've got some preliminary indications, it appears to be working, that's something you can decide is valuable to tell your audience about. But it's just important that in doing so, that you are open and honest about the limitations and what you do know and what you don't know. All right. If we move on, I want to give some examples of this. Again, this will look familiar to anyone who's done any work with data. Just quantitative evidence that simply talks about something and then gives the numbers, and here, this effort on childhood obesity, over 4 years, obesity dropped from 11.5% to 10.5%. Very quickly, you get a sense there was some movement, and you get a sense of the scope of the movement, right? A little bit, some, but not a whole lot. And then a little more, granular data, more affluent families, decline from this to this. Overall, a drop of 9.4 to 8.8. Is that proof that this program worked? Not necessarily. There could be sort of other factors at play, and hopefully the story went on to discuss, the factors that might also contributed to this. But sort of a very simple classic example of quantitative evidence in a story. Another one from the Atlantic, right? Effort in Iceland to reduce teen drug use. Very significant here. Percentage of 15, 16-year-olds who've been drunk in the previous month plummeted from 42% to 5%. That 42% number seems shocking to me, but I'm not 15 or 16 anymore. Use of cannabis down from 17% to 7%, smoking 23% down to just 3%. Again, you'd want to explain these numbers, make sure that they're in context, make sure that they're accurate. But nevertheless, a good use of numbers to sort of provide some evidence, in support of the idea that this response is working well. All right, a couple examples of qualitative evidence. It's actually a project, Solutions Journalism Network, just supported. And here we have, this was a project on foster care, trying to reduce how often children are sort of shuttled from one home or group home to another. And as part of this effort that this state did, they sent a survey to providers. And you can see here what their impressions were. They had general praise for it, thought it was working. That bottom one, providers, more willing to extend move dates, meaning, sort of pause and not be so quick to move a child from one home to another. We don't have data here. We don't, I'd still be curious. Well, all right, but did it really reduce the number of moves? I'd love to have sort of some hard numbers there, but nevertheless, it does count as evidence that you have people involved saying, yes, this is working well. for us. We've seen the impact of this. We've seen providers thinking differently, about moving children. And you can sort of, draw an inference. Okay, well, that the bottom line effort here is we really want to reduce how often children are moved around in foster care. And this is some evidence that this program they put in place is having that impact, even in the absence of sort of hard numbers showing, yes, it went from, this many moves on average to this many moves on average. And qualitative evidence, maybe not as compelling, as sort of, hard as quantitative evidence, but still very valuable, very useful. Another example is from the new humanitarian on Mozambique and the climate crisis. And they talked to one individual, said, yes, I've heard the warnings on radio and television, right? These are an early warning system for cyclones. And so, yes, let's hear from those directly involved. In the past, he would not have heard, these sirens and warnings, might not have had the benefit of them, but sure. For one person they're working, then that bottom there, most residents in urban areas told the new humanitarian they received warning messages, but majority of people in rural areas said they heard nothing. Now, when we say the majority of people in rural places, obviously they didn't interview every single inhabitant of a rural area of Mozambique, but it's sort of clear here they did sort of, some degree of surveying and reach some conclusions about it. That when they talked to folks in urban areas, they generally heard, yeah, we heard them. In rural areas, not so much. Again, we don't know, well, was it 60%? Was it 90%? Were they successful in reaching everyone in an urban area? The majority in rural areas said they didn't hear. Is that like nobody heard, or, a little more than half didn't hear? Right. We don't have sort of that clarity that comes with quantitative evidence, but we still have evidence. It's important. I mean, one, again, we get that sort of human element in there, talking to someone directly involved, but we also have, indications that something is having the desired effect. It may not be quantitative indications, but nevertheless, we have that. And again, for journalism, I think it's a really compelling combination if you can have both quantitative and qualitative evidence. Kind of quantitative evidence to explain and describe the magnitude and the breadth of impact, and qualitative to make it personal, kind of bring it home. All right, let us move on then and talk about where to find evidence. And I'm going to start on the quantitative side with this. And start out by saying there is just tons and tons of government data around the world. It's not, the only source of data by any means, but there is a great deal of it. There used to be very, very little of it. I mean, obviously, at some point there was, virtually none, or it was very difficult to get. Go back, a couple of decades, and it was hard to get data from governments. And even when, at the paper I worked at, when we would get data, we'd sort of, keep it quiet. If we had, salaries of state employees or something, we thought, well, let's use it, cautiously. We're certainly not going to, just put the entire thing out there, or there's going to be this backlash, and we're never going to get it again. And now there's been, getting access to government information in open countries and closed countries, remains a constant challenge. It is just a never-ending battle to get governments, even in advanced democracies, to give up information that, after all, belongs to the people in a democracy. And of course, yet more difficult in some other countries. But that said, there has been a change in attitude about government data, and now an enormous number of countries, of provinces, of states, of cities have pretty substantial data portals available. I had heard that getting data was difficult in Bosnia. I don't know if that's accurate. I think that's what I heard. So I thought, let me sort of poke around there. And you can see this is, the statistical agency in Bosnia, and they have a boatload of data in here. If you're not familiar with this and you're in Bosnia, most definitely give it a look. It's bhas.gov.ba, or obviously, just Google it. Whatever country you're in, whatever area that you cover. If you're not familiar with the government portal, data portal, in your area, just Google it and see what they have. Again, in the state in the United States where I am in Connecticut, every single penny that the state pays, it is instantly uploaded and available for everyone to see. There's something literally called open checkbook, and you can just see where the money is going. And you can tell every single employee how much money did they make, what their job title is, when they started, how much did they make in overtime. All that is available here and lots of places around the world. So again, often available at the national level, state or provincial level, and sometimes larger cities and towns will have their own portals as well. A great source of data if you're trying to see how are things going in my community, how do they compare with other places. There are also places that aggregate government data, sometimes make it more useful. Certainly we'll compile it from multiple places, and that can be valuable. Again, you may be familiar with these. The World Bank is sort of well known, the amount of information that it has. And again, I hope I wasn't mistaken on Bosnia as a place where data can be difficult, but I looked at the World Bank. There were, I think hundreds of opportunities. I filtered just for some data about schools, and there were, a number of metrics that they didn't have any data for in Bosnia, but you can see, I hope it's not too small, on your screens. There's a fair amount here, progression to secondary school percentages, tertiary school enrollment, primary school enrollment, adolescents out of school. Some of the data, isn't terribly recent, but there's a fair amount of 2020 data in there. There is often data out there, even if you're sort of not aware of it. Don't give up hope on finding data. There are places out there. So in addition to the World Bank, our world in data, again, amasses just a gigantic amount of data. Some of it commonplace, some of it fairly obscure. I would love it if someone on this call is in Bosnia and was just working on a story about lettuce and was just dying to know, yeah, but how much lettuce does Bosnia produce in a given year? Well, it only goes through 2018, but yes, lettuce yields in tons per hectare, is available, and maybe there's an interesting story of, what happened in 2018 after, a number of years of declining lettuce production. There was a big surge. Is that a story? I don't know, but the data are there. Even if you may think, oh, I'm never, going to be able to find this. So, all right, sticking with quantitative data, there are non-governmental organizations, certainly, that simply, aggregate government data. But there are, any number of NGOs that kind of collect their own data. This is an example, Elephants Without Borders put together a group funded by one of the Microsoft founders to do kind of an elephant survey, right? This isn't something, I guess, that was available through government data, but an NGO on their own said, let's go out and find this. So certainly if you're working on a story around a particular topic, yes, see if there are NGOs involved that certainly might, simply help your reporting, help point you to relevant evidence from government or elsewhere, but might also have assembled evidence on their own. All right, and then in addition, academic research. I think reporters, journalists don't take advantage of academic work kind of as well as they could. There's just an enormous amount going on. There's often, government or other funding to kind of really dive into an issue in a way that journalists often can't. And so if you sort of, get clued into what's going on in academic research, I think there's sort of just a gold mine of information there to be mined, again, that we often overlook. So this example here, looking at the nitrogen footprint, right? We all know about the carbon footprint. Apparently, there's an issue with the nitrogen footprint. And here we have, research by University of Melbourne PhD candidate Emily Yang. So again, someone has already taken the time to kind of dive into this issue and has put out a report on it. So consider that also as a potential source of valuable data, and also, frankly, expertise, which we'll get into with kind of qualitative data. All right, and indeed, moving on to qualitative data. Certainly, like we saw with the Mozambique story, just on the ground interviews, getting, anecdotal evidence. Again, you want to be cautious about it. We often say, if you've ever, covered courts, that eyewitnesses, juries often really like eyewitnesses, and lawyers and judges know that eyewitness testimony is often absolutely the least reliable, right? And we have a tendency to not always evaluate things properly, and certainly things that we have a great interest in or that are traumatic and the like, often our minds don't sort of perfectly process them. So you want to be cautious. Is someone exaggerating? Does this sort of sound right? Were they, in a position really to see what was going on? Are they really sort of a participant in, whatever it is that you're writing about? But again, people's thoughts on things are important. They sort of count as evidence. So, this is a story here sort of asserting, in isolation, teens find new paths to community amid the pandemic. And this is, hopefully not the only evidence they had, but again, this is one teen talking about, yes, this loneliness was real, and here's something that I did kind of to address it. That is supporting evidence. It doesn't have the hard numbers behind it, but again, it is evidence there. All right, moving on. Yes, anecdotal evidence, but ideally not by itself, right? We have this one person talking about, yes, social media helped me feel less isolated, but great to be able to kind of back that up with, some more broader information. And here we have, a Pew Research poll showing 81% of respondents said that social media helped them feel, more connected, not less connected. Maybe not sort of an exact match, on, well, it was about loneliness, not about connectedness, or those necessarily the same thing, but nevertheless, if you sort of describe the potential limitations there, valuable to include that, and add some good support to your anecdote. If you can say, here's one person, let's humanize it with this individual, but it's not just this one person. There's some evidence that it's broader than that. And that survey, that Pew Research Center poll, it's kind of a hybrid quantitative, qualitative evidence, right? I mean, it's data in the sense that it's numerical, but it's sort of data, on qualitative information. And that's kind of the nature of surveys and polls. But again, still evidence. There is a ton of questionable survey data out there. Sadly, much of which news outlets are sort of more than happy to run. There's, is there anything clickbaitier than a good survey with some sort of outrageous results that may or may not, be accurate? But nevertheless, used cautiously and judiciously and thinking about the source. That sort of qualitative evidence, definitely valuable and important. I said there's sort of some bad survey data out there. This is Newsweek, a major publication, or at least it was at one point, sharing with its readers the important news that half of Americans admit to wearing their underwear 2 days or more in a row. Why this was paired with a story of the Czech president burning a giant pair of underwear, I don't know, but that is what a major news outlet did. And you will see if you read this, the poll was conducted by a manufacturer of underwear. So, I mean, who knows how they conducted this and the like, but hey, a major news outlet was more than happy to run it. So don't be like Newsweek in this case. Survey data can be valuable evidence, but just be aware there's plenty of bad data out there as well. All right, more sort of qualitative evidence, certainly experts with relevant experience in an area. This is a story from the LA Times about some places finding, quarantine buddies to lessen isolation, sort of raising the issue. We all have sort of our, circle of our immediate families during COVID. Is there an issue if you sort of start going outside that circle, bring more, into your circle? And we don't have, statistical evidence, there's no study done. We had one group that, just stayed with their family, and another group that invited quarantine buddies in, and X% in this group got COVID and Y% in that, right? We don't have anything like that. But Jeffrey Martin, a professor of epidemiology and a biostatistician, sort of chimes in here, knowing what he knows about viruses. He writes, if you can keep the circle small, it doesn't matter if you're related or not, that can still sort of, be a safe way of limiting your contacts. Doesn't have data to back that up. But based on his experience, if you're satisfied, this is someone who knows what he's talking about and what he's saying kind of makes sense. Then that's evidence that sort of absolutely counts. And again, it can be strong evidence if you get someone with real expertise that can be compelling, that can kind of help make your case. All right, we went over kind of a bunch of things there. So I just kind of want to recap on where to find evidence, right? Government portals and those places that kind of aggregate data from multiple government portals, data that's amassed by other researchers, NGOs, and academics, survey data certainly serve as evidence, direct interviews for those who are involved or affected, and then sort of lastly, experts in the field. All right. Again,
Matthew,
I think
before we go on,
yes, yeah.
There was an interesting kind of experience shared in the chat that had kind of a question attached to it from,
okay.
Forgive me if I mispronounce your name. I think it's Deva. If you wanted to ask, or can read the chat.
Shall I read it myself?
Yeah. If you could share your.
Sure.
No, so I was just sharing experience that I was working on a story with my colleagues that where an official claims that numerous people have filed claims over their property being damaged by fallen trees, and this was a kind of standoff between these officials and local activists to say that more trees should be protected and fewer trees should be cut. And the local activists tried to request statistics, and no one was able to give it to her. And the closest that I could find to verify everyone's claims was to look at the court rulings database. Those are available, and then I could count how many cases per year the court had, and from insurance companies who are trying to sue for damages and reclaim the money they paid out to their clients. But then obviously this omits people who do not have insurance, who decided not to bother with a claim, or maybe individuals don't go to court for this, and only very powerful insurance companies do that. So that's clearly a clear limitation, and I wasn't sure how to use this data till today.
Okay, so a couple of things I say there. You had said that that nobody was able to give her that data. I'm sure there were people who technically were able to. So what we had is no one was willing to give that information there, and you know, this sort of gets away from solution journalism. To me, I think it's a story when governments refuse to answer questions and provide information. I mean, if you have an official saying, look, we've had this, you know, big increase, or there's a large number going on here, you know, I'd press really hard and say, show me. You know, if you want people to believe you, show me. If you can't, I often say, look, you know, when I was reporting, I would say, you don't have to tell me, but what do you think my readers are going to conclude if you won't? Right? I mean, the only natural assumption is you're lying, that this isn't happening. So I don't want to put you in that position. Just show me. You must have the numbers. You didn't, you know, I'm going to assume you didn't make this up. You're saying a large number have. So right, you've looked at this. So show me. And if you won't show me, then I got to tell my readers, you know, and viewers that you wouldn't show me. So on the data side of it, I think the court data, you know, if it's, well, there were 150, you know, I don't, is that 1%, 10%, a tenth of 1% of the actual damage? Who knows? You know, maybe some experts in insurance could help you say, typically, you know, you wouldn't expect to see a lawsuit in any more than one in blank cases. It maybe get you somewhere there. But where I do think you might be able to use court data is in showing a trend over time. If, you know, there actually were 3 times as many lawsuits, you know, in the last year than 5 years ago, unless someone were to say, it's much easier to go to court these days. That explains the increase, or, you know, or insurance companies have gotten much more aggressive about rejecting claims. You know, that's sort of well known. That's why you're seeing more lawsuits. If you can sort of, you know, can't come up with sort of any other explanation for why there would be that surge in court cases, then you might be able to assume maybe there really is sort of more damage there. And that's a case where, you know, certainly on a solution side, we talk about the importance of including the limitations. You know, this is what we know, that this is the trend in court cases. But, you know, that doesn't necessarily translate to blank. And we couldn't get more information, you know, but the sort of struggle between the activists and the officials continue. So yes, I think that, you know, long answer. Yeah, I think that could be used as evidence, so long as you know, your audience understands that it's not perfect evidence, and you know, has those limitations.
Oh, and Matthew, I had one other question for you that might be addressed in the next section too, but what about how should you approach evidence that if you are focusing on an organization, for example, that's providing a solution, and they have, data that they collect themselves as part of their organization. So it's not necessarily from like an independent government portal or academic research kind of entity, but it's evidence given to you from your source of the solution. How is that enough evidence for your solutions journalism story, or is that just as valid as like something that might come from like a government portal or something that's an independent entity from the people providing the solution?
Right. So it's different, right, than if it came from an independent entity. But imagine you're doing a story about a government agency, and you talk to an employee working there, and you talk to an employee who was fired. You might, or let's say you've talked to an official, you talk to the head of the agency, and you talk to someone who was fired. In both of those cases, right, you'd have your typical journalism skepticism, at play there. The official has, a reason to maybe overstate how well things are working, and the fired whistleblower might have a reason to, exaggerate how bad things are. But those are the sorts of things we, evaluate as journalists sort of all the time. So if you have an organization saying, hey, we run this program, and, look at the evidence showing how great it is, then sort of, I'd say do your journalistic sort of due diligence there, really question them on how was this collected? How complete is it? Take me through what it is that you measured. If it was a survey, who did you talk to about this? Did you talk to everyone? Was it random? Did you select the people who were going to participate, in this sort of roundtable talking about it? It's reason to be a little more skeptical. Now, honestly, some people are more skeptical of government data, frankly, but if there's an interested party providing the evidence, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, there's reason to be skeptical, but it is our lot in life as journalists to be skeptical and do our best to get at the truth. So I wouldn't dismiss it as evidence, but I would, interrogate its source, and I'd make sure readers knew, where it came from, and not simply say, as a result, 30% blah, 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 say, as a result, the group says, a survey by the group showed, make it clear that readers know where that's coming from and that it might have, a conflict. All right. Do we have anything else? Are we ready to move on? It looks like some more has come in. I'm not sure if they're questioned about it.
Some of the questions are actually going to be answered in your next section.
Great.
We can
Okay.
move on, and I'll make sure to note any of the questions that are answered.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, so we've talked a whole lot about what evidence is, where to find it and the like. Let's move on, how to vet, how to kind of analyze evidence there. And I want to start with, again, sort of quantitative evidence, data type evidence. And I would say we start with 3 key questions. Is it trustworthy? Is it accurate? Is it relevant? Relevant to the story that you're doing. So trustworthy, accurate, relevant. And those are kind of the questions to, ask yourself as you're getting into this, and some ways, steps to do that. We've just talked a little bit about this. Sort of always consider the source, right? Who gathered the evidence? Who paid for it? Is there a reason to suspect bias there? I did a project years ago on academic medical research and whether it could be trusted. And so there were people on the scientific side saying, hey, science is science, right? I mean, it's a study, it's a double-blind study. We couldn't compromise it even if we wanted to. And that's sort of simply not the case, right? I mean, they're what are called meta-analyses, where, someone will look at a whole bunch of surveys or studies on a particular area and see sort of how they play out. And those sort of analyses have shown kind of again and again that, who is sort of paying for or stands to benefit from the survey, when the funding is coming from someone with an interest in the outcome, those studies statistically are more favorable than studies done on the same, drug or product or whatever, as studies done by more independent organizations. There are lots of ways to kind of skew what's going on, even in like a really professional seeming study. You enroll a bunch of people in a drug trial and it doesn't work for some people, and you find a reason to go, you know what, actually, I don't think they really fit the criteria to be in the study. We're going to kind of take them out of it. They're not going to get included, in the final analysis. Again, if there is a reason to suspect an interest, a bias, it doesn't mean you dismiss the data, but you are more cautious about it. And again, you make sure that your audience kind of knows that. And then and it's not just necessarily a financial conflict, right? I mean, people have strong views on different areas. And so, if, I don't know, someone is a huge fan of private schools or something, and they do a survey showing students in private schools outperform comparable students in public schools. Again, I wouldn't necessarily completely dismiss that data, but I'd give it a sort of more cautious eye, and again, make sure that people knew what the source of it was. Even if people think they're doing, absolutely accurate and above board work, bias can creep in there. And then for academic research, it's worth taking a look, was it peer reviewed? And what that means is that people who are not involved in the research have looked it over and have sort of given it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And that can be an indication, it can increase your kind of confidence in the work that was done, that others, presumably independent, have given it kind of their, seal of approval there. All right, again, on the quantitative side, data journalists often talk about interviewing your data. And we mean that sometimes in the sense when we're getting to the analysis stage of things, of, your data is a source, you have questions, it has answers. Interview your data to get it to, talk about, as it were, the answers. But there's sort of a stage even before we get to the analysis of really considering your data and thinking about what it is that I have here. What am I looking at? So, what exactly did they collect? I mean, really kind of get like really, really nerdy and step back and think, what exactly is the metric that they were looking at here? And how did they collect that? And certainly, when did they collect that? And think about anything that is missing from the data that, I don't know, you're looking into a needle exchange program, looking to sort of, reduce infections from, intravenous drug use. And you've got a report where, the group running this says, and we're happy to report we've had a 60% growth in our client base over the last year, or 80% of our clients, our first-time clients come back, at least one more time. So it's clearly working. You can say, well, all right, it's working in terms of client numbers. Is it working in reducing infections, kind of thing? So think about, is this, how directly does this relate to what it is that I'm trying to measure? Again, being like getting really, really sort of left brain and scientific about digging in there and really kind of putting on kind of maximum skepticism there. Just, be your data's own worst critic and trying to say, are there any holes here I should be aware of? Certainly anything involving it's kind of, survey data, make sure you understand sample sizes, margins of error. There again is, bad data out there based on just sort of tiny sample sizes that don't really, kind of reflect what's going on there. And in terms of this isn't listed here, but sampling error, who actually did they ask about this? This very famous case in the United States, the race for president in 1936 between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Alf Landon, and a magazine called Literary Digest did this very sophisticated thing. They sent out, millions, I think, of postcards asking who you're going to vote for. They got telephone directories for every major area and called everyone, or thousands and thousands of people. They got these mailings that they did. They got lists of magazine subscriptions and social club registries, and put together this huge thing there. Well, this was 1936. And not everyone had a telephone in 1936, in the middle of the Depression. And not everyone could afford magazine subscriptions or belong to social clubs. So they came out with their big prediction that Alf Landon was going to absolutely cream Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they were absolutely wrong because they didn't have an accurate sample. They, only interviewed wealthier people, and wealthier people were more likely to support Alf Landon, the Republican, in that. So always, with any kind of survey data, really make sure you understand what did they do, how did they do it. For polls and surveys in particular, certainly read the questions. It is so easy to put in a really loaded questions. Do you think spending on blank is a total waste of money? It kind of sounds like, yeah, do you think we should implement policies to XYZ, or should we completely ignore the problem? Right, it's really, really easy to write leading questions in surveys. So if you're working off data with a survey, really make sure, don't just look at 40% said this, look at what exactly was the question that was asked. Again, even the simplest data, just, population data, right? That seems really, really simple. How many people live in this town? Well, if there's a prison in the town, are the inmates counted? If there's a boarding school, are students counted? If there are soldiers who live in the town but are deployed overseas, are they counted? Again, just like so many questions you should have, and just really, really, really wondering, am I sure I have the absolute 100%, clarity into what is going on here? All right. What is next here? We talked about surveys and being skeptical and the like. I've always liked this headline from Vox. Study. Half of the studies you read about in the news are wrong. And then the subhead, and yes, this could be one of them. And I actually haven't read the full article here. I actually borrowed this slide from a colleague here, and I don't know if they're sort of being tongue-in-cheek here. And in fact, there is no study saying that half of studies you read about in the news are wrong. But nevertheless, a good reminder, be cautious with with all data, and certainly with study data. All right, oops, I moved that over. Hang on, sorry, I moved a window where I didn't want it. Hang on. Now we're back. Okay. Moving on. And again, Nicole, if there's anything up, feel free to chime in. We talked about quantitative data, right? And the importance there, and the big three questions. So for anecdotes and opinions, for more of that qualitative evidence there, it's the exact same three questions. Again, ask yourself, is it trustworthy? is it accurate? Is it relevant, to the story I'm working on? Does it match well? Does it really show or speak to what it is that I'm writing about, or is it sort of, slightly off? So if you are talking with, the direct participants in some incident, do they know what they're talking about? Do they have really direct knowledge of it? And does it kind of pass the smell test? Does it, sound accurate? Does it feel like they're exaggerating? Or might they have an agenda here? Again, the same way you evaluate all the information that you come across as a journalist certainly applies here as you're looking for evidence in a solution story. With an expert, are they really an expert? Do they have that expertise? Do they have kind of relevant experience? And same issues, with bias that we look at with data. For both, right? Do the impressions that they're giving, the thoughts and opinions and the like, again, does it really sort of speak to the the success or the quality of whatever it is, the response that you're investigating, right? We mentioned that needle exchange program before. So yeah, let's talk to people in the program and see, is it having the desired effect? And everyone you talk to, all they're willing to say is, the people are really, really nice. I feel really welcome there. They're good people. Their hearts are in the right place. That's not evidence that it's, keeping them from sharing needles and the like, right? I mean, that's maybe a fine thing to include, but again, doesn't get to, the evidence that you're looking for in terms of impact. So you would want to press and say, great. So are you taking advantage of it? Do you still share needles? And if someone says, well, to be perfectly honest, I go there once a month when they're open and I get one needle and I'll use that clean needle. But honestly, the other 29, 30 days of the month, no, I got my group of guys that we share needles with, then that's relevant and maybe indicates it's not working all that well. But again, so, the relevant side of trustworthy, accurate, relevant, does it honestly speak to the response that you're writing about? And if not, maybe, need to press a little bit harder on that. All right, we've talked a lot about vetting evidence and certainly vetting data. And now I think we're going to vet some data. I'm going to put a link in the chat. And I think, let me copy that. Okay. Yeah, it's going to be, I'll put it in the chat in a minute. It's going to be this chart. That shows death rates from unsafe water sources, 2000 to 2017 in Czechia. And what I want you to do, and you'll see, I just put that in the chart. I want you to, we're going to go into breakout rooms and just sort of, jot down some questions that you have about this data that you'd want to make sure resolved kind of before diving in. So we're not at the data analysis stage. We're not, trying to come up with, how could we turn this into a story? Instead, this is, you've been handed some data, thinking about maybe doing a story, but before you, get to the stage of that, I want you to kind of go a step back and just sort of start with, all right, what am I looking at here? What do I have here? So again, let's go into breakout rooms. What do we have? 33. Yeah, let's do 6 rooms.
Okay.
So go in there, and again, it's explained a little more, in the document. In the chat, again, just sort of, jot down some questions that would help you understand what is it that I'm looking at here? What do you need sort of explained or answered in order to kind of take the next step and do some data analysis? So let's do that for, I don't know, 5 or 6 minutes. Let's say 6 minutes. Then we'll come back and kind of hear what some of you have come up with. I hope that was meaningful, and again, sort of, getting your nerd on and really thinking, all right, what do I need to know before I kind of start seeing what I can do with this data. We have a fairly large group. We certainly won't hear from everyone, but feel free to write any questions that you had in the chat, or raise your hand, or unmute if you'd like to, and just let's get just a couple of questions that you had. Before I do something with this, I really need to know blank. Anyone want to chime in?
I posted some of the questions that my group had in the chat, but we were basically like, what's the source of information? If is it a water company? Is it from the government? Who did the sampling? Where's the data coming from? How many people live there? Was the population much smaller in 2000 versus 2017? Because of course, if it was a lot smaller, the data doesn't mean as much. Do we have data before 2000? What was it? Was there a significant event that happened in that 17-year period?
All right. Anyone else? Although that pretty much covered it. That was excellent.
Okay, maybe I will.
Sorry.
Okay, I'll just add maybe one question, because I'm Czech and I'm quite appalled because I thought that the drinking water in Czechia is really of very good quality, and they keep telling us that it's really better than the bottled baby water. So I would like to see the statistics of other countries to get some comparison. And also, what do we mean by the water sources? Is it because they drank something from the tap, like the drinking water from the pipes, official, or was it because they have some like illegal water pumps in their village and they don't get the samples tested regularly? We just need more context. This was like totally taken out of context. So
excellent. Yep.
Some comparison for sure.
Okay, so what came into mind was what was the gap that all over those years it wasn't addressed? Like we could see it's increasing after 2002. So there was 2 years to make a response, and why it was and it wasn't been responded, and then
Good,
it
good.
increased.
So that's step 2, which is awesome, because we're sort of going to get to that a little bit later of the right. What are the questions we have for others sort of about the data? Yeah, Em, I see you're unmuted. You have thoughts on or questions on, or maybe you didn't mean to unmute.
Oh no, I didn't mean to. I was just kind of nodding
Okay.
what you were saying.
Right.
Maybe
You
just
looked
one-
shocked, so I thought, yeah, maybe that was inadvertent.
Maybe just one more comment. We were
Sure.
trying in our breakout room, we were trying to figure out how many roughly every year. So I thought that's hopefully this is correct, around 25 or 30 individuals per country, and the population is 10 million. So 25 individuals die, because of some faulty water sources. 25, and the question is where they're from the same region, maybe were they from the same village, because there may have been some, like recently there was a toxic waste leak in the river in Moravia. So like more context, where were they from? Was it just one region, or were they from all over the place? More context.
Yeah, good. All right.
And just one other thought, what exactly is the primary cause of death here, and is unsafe water the primary cause of that, with underlying health conditions, complicating factors? I think when you look at death records, there's a lot of different factors that contribute to the cause of death. So maybe parsing that out a little bit.
Terrific. Yes, that is such a great point. All right. Yeah, so let me run down some of those. Thanks for all of those. This was so great. Again, a lot of people might look at this and go, yeah, this is fairly straightforward. This is, how many people died from unsafe water, but sort of every word in this, kind of needs to be kind of carefully parsed. I mean, first, the starters, right? Who gathered this and the like. But, so death rates from unsafe water sources, right? You've mentioned this, like, well, water source, what do you mean by that? Are you talking about from, unsafe like lakes and rivers, or are you talking about contaminated bottles of water? So, what exactly do you mean by water sources? What do you mean by unsafe? What metric are you using there? What made this water source, whatever that is, safe, but this one unsafe? What's sort of the measurement there? Was it consistent over time? Deaths from, right? This is a great point Michelle just made. What do we mean by deaths from? Was it, how did they determine this death got counted, this death did not? And frankly, unsafe, right? I think we've mostly assumed they're talking about unsafe drinking water. It's conceivable, I doubt it, that by unsafe water sources, they mean really like dangerous rapids. We're talking about drownings here. How many people have died, doing recreation in dangerous areas? I don't think that's what it is, but you'd want to be absolutely sure. There's a question about the vertical axis, sort of that's, you can see from the subhead, it may be small on your screens. This is deaths per 100,000. So we're talking tiny numbers, right? So, it tops out at about 0.3 per 100,000. So, 3 per million, basically. Not big numbers, but, and someone said, do we have data earlier than this? And certainly, do we have data later than this? It would. Hey, this is 18 years worth of data. That's a fair amount. But it would be interesting to see, since we see sort of this, suddenly significant increase in the middle of the chart. Was it pretty flat before all of this? So again, before we get into the analysis of what's going on, we need to know what exactly are we looking at. And these were all great questions about where this came from, what it measured, what they mean by these various elements, unsafe, deaths, and the like. All right, we will actually come back to this chart and dig a little bit deeper in there. But for now, let's answer this question. This has sort of been raised in a couple of different ways of how much evidence do I need for a solution story? And this one is really easy. In a way, it's kind of what you need for, putting any story in. This is just sort of news judgment 101. You need enough evidence to satisfy you and your editor, producer, that it's credible and that it's worth telling people about. Again, in sort of the same way we would judge something's going on. Is this something, relevant to my audience? If you're satisfied, we're not looking for proof beyond a reasonable doubt here. If you're satisfied, hey, there was this problem and there was a response, and here's the evidence that it was working. And if it strikes you as, I find this believable and relevant and important, then you have enough evidence to go forward. We talked some about, when that evidence is sort of just getting started out there. And you can see here, early stage stories don't often have much evidence, but you can cover it, be frank about this is just getting off the ground. The evidence so far seems provisional or, somewhat anecdotal, maybe some guesswork in there, may not, hit all the elements, all the pillars of a solution story. But let them know, and we're going to come back to this. We're going to keep on this and let you know how things go, as it goes forward. So speaking of limited evidence, let's talk about dealing with limited evidence and the different ways that you can still have a strong solution story, even if sort of the direct evidence of something working is somewhat limited. And the first is thinking about data proxies. And this is sort of true kind of in all data journalism. You know, sometimes you have data that's directly on point, and sometimes it's not directly on point, but it sort of, you know, matches in a way that, well, as this goes up, you'd expect this to go up as well. So it makes sort of a decent proxy for it. This is a story from here in the US on, you know, attempting to slow the spread of COVID and do shutdowns, you know, have the effect of keeping people from, you know, congregating and potentially spreading COVID around. So we wanted to know, when we have the Nashville residents have cut daily movements in half. Well, we don't actually know that, you know, from an absolute standpoint. We had, you know, trackers on everyone, but we had something reasonably close, which is not how much did people move around, but how much did their cell phones move around. You know, I don't always have my cell phone on me. It's always funny when I look in the middle of the day and it says, you have 0 steps. And it's like, well, it's because my phone's been on my desk all day. But nevertheless, certainly if they're, you know, you're traveling some distance, most people will have their phone with them. Most people have phones. Most people have their phone. So here's a case where, no, we weren't able to say, you know, that people were moving around less, you know, from an absolute, we can prove it. We had, you know, ankle bracelets on everyone, but we've got a pretty decent proxy for that. And some way, this is sort of, you know, like a double proxy in that what we're really trying to do is stop the spread of COVID, and we're using as a proxy, if we can stop travel and gatherings, then we can do that. And, you know, that's proxy number 1 and proxy number 2. And we can use cell phone data to see whether or not it appears when we shut down businesses that people are in fact not moving around as much. So if there's something that isn't kind of, you know, quite perfect there, think about, is there a proxy? I don't know, you're doing a story on a high school program designed to prepare people better for you know, university, and you'd like to know, I don't know, are people better prepared? And it's like, you know, what exactly does that mean? And do we have to wait 4 years and see, you know, if they graduate? Well, maybe you could look at what percentage of you know, the students who went through the program required remedial classes, you know, when they got to university, or, you know, something like that. I mean, think about what it is that you'd like to measure, and if you can't measure it, or there just isn't that information available, is there something kind of close enough? And that, you know, may not be perfect evidence, but imperfect evidence, still evidence. All right, secondly, evidence from elsewhere. I love this idea. It sort of came up in that Michigan example that we saw. Most ideas don't, you know, come out of just brilliant inspiration. I mean, yes, it happens. Honestly, most certainly government interventions, they're borrowed. You know, someone comes up with a smart idea and then other places learn about it and follow it. So this is an example here in Milwaukee, here in the States, where there is a site that allows people to shoot heroin, I guess under sort of more, you know, cautious settings here. And folks in Wisconsin are researching the idea. Hasn't started in Wisconsin, but they're thinking about doing it. So we have no evidence of whether or not this will be effective in Wisconsin because it hasn't even started there, but it's been done elsewhere. So yeah, the solutions focus, you'd say, let me find other places that have tried this and how did it work out there? So you can see here in places where supervised injection sites have been operating for years, research has shown the sites lead more people into treatment. You might want to get a little more specific about that, but it's there. And you'd also want to, obviously, are there limitations? You know, are there place is really comparable? Is there, you'd want to be open about, while it worked in Vancouver, the situation is slightly different in Milwaukee because XYZ, whatever, the laws are different, something, right? You want to explain the limitations, but offering evidence from elsewhere, that can be really strong evidence in support of a solution story. All right, qualitative evidence. Again, we've talked about its value as evidence. It also can be kind of a strong substitute when there isn't that quantitative evidence just yet. If you remember this slide from the foster care project, where there was a survey to see how well things did. Let's sort of scoot down that paragraph and pull up the paragraph before it. So the people involved in here acknowledge there are still gaps. They need better tracking and monitoring, right? It's a little early to get that sort of hard data on the program success, but with limited data, they're relying on qualitative results. This is sort of great transparency about, we're limited on the quantitative side, so let us tell you what we have on the qualitative side that points to the success of the program. So great use there. I think we are going to move on to analyzing evidence. Again, I'll stop here if there are questions before we move on to the next part of it. If not, let us move on to analyzing evidence. And by analyzing, I don't mean the crunching of the numbers and how to make sense of quantitative evidence in a spreadsheet. That could be a whole other 2-hour session on that. And instead, sort of just quickly speaking, most data journalism, most solutions journalism, as I said before, the basics of spreadsheet knowledge will carry you most of the way, importing, sorting, filtering, maybe pivot tables, knowing how to do some basic cleaning, on kind of the numbers crunching side. If you have those basic skills, you're in really, really good shape. Honestly, for the vast majority of data journalism, most journalists will encounter, and certainly for solutions journalism using data. But for this foray into analyzing evidence, I really mean kind of how to find a solutions journalism story in data. And we've gone over this to some extent. It's really two ways to think about it. Comparing one time to another. Here's a story from Reasons to be Cheerful, Portugal's widely successful decriminalization experiment. I don't know, the Sojo and me, it's like, oh, it was wildly successful. Is that overstating it? But nevertheless, they looked at what went on in 2010 and what went on in 2016. And it dropped 45%. So, strong evidence there showing after this went into effect, we saw an impact there. So comparing one time to another, and secondly, comparing one place to another. You've got two places, they responded differently. What was the difference in the impact there? This sort of famous example from the 1918 flu epidemic. St. Louis, very early on, closed down schools and movie theaters and ultimately businesses, asked churches not to gather. Philadelphia instead did a giant citywide parade to try to sell war bonds. And you can see the impact. Philadelphia eventually shut all businesses down, and you can see, the impact that had. But yes, comparing one place to another, kind of very valuable there. So one, going back, comparing one time to another with data, comparing one place to another. And next up is analyzing some data. And in interest of time, I'm going to sort of speed through this because most of these actually came up when we were talking about vetting the data. So what could we do, with that water source data that we had? And people talked about wanting to see what was going on in a broader time range, and certainly comparing someone had the great point. I'd like to, see, can I compare this to what's going on in other countries? And that can get you a sense of, is there something to write about here? On the comparing over time, I do see we have this steady increase, and then the curve really turns right around here. So at least for the Czech Republic, I might be interested. Was there some intervention around 2015? Did they do something differently? And that might explain the downturn. That could make for a good isolated, Czech Republic story. In terms of, can I see what's going on in other countries? Yes, there's actually an enormous amount of data and longer time. This is tiny, you may not be able to see. We have data going back to 1990 with this water data, once we figure out what it is, for scores and scores and scores of countries. I looked at just Central European countries, and you can see something troubling going on in Hungary and the Czech Republic. Most other places doing much better. And it's kind of hard to tell. The UK is this sort of magenta color here, starts rising and then drops pretty significantly as time went on. Did the UK do something? While in Czechia, things were skyrocketing. Again, fairly small numbers, but still, as a percentage, as a per 100,000, going way, way up, while it was, cut in half in the UK. Maybe there were outside factors, who knows? But if they were doing something that the Czech Republic was not, that might make for, a better, strong solution story. Someone asked about World in Data. I believe they simply are aggregators of government data. So, the data is going to be as accurate as it comes from the countries. And again, for, I think most European countries, most Western countries, it's probably fairly reliable, so long as it's sort of not on a controversial area where sometimes, it gets a little more dicey. Moving on, make sure we have time for questions. How to use evidence in a solution story. And just want to kind of run through some examples there of different ways to use evidence. And in some ways, how not to use it, I guess. Do not overclaim, don't overstate, don't say more than you know, don't try to predict the future. And, here's the evidence. And so this shows this is going to be a resounding success, or, they've cut it by this much each year, so the problem will go away, by 2028, right? Don't say things like that. We've talked about this, tell the audience what you don't know, be very open about that. Recognize the value of graphs in presenting data. And certainly be careful, this can be my last point, on causation and correlation, right? So a response goes into effect, and then the curve on the chart bends. Maybe it was because of the response, but maybe it wasn't. So just be cautious about, might there be other factors that have moved the needle independent of this response that was put in place. Crime rates. Crime rates go in waves based on, frankly, how many teenagers and young 20-year-olds there are in a country. So, you always want to be cautious about, wow, they put this new policy in and crime went up or crime went down. The policy may have had some impact, but lots of other factors may have had something to do as well. Certainly the economy, affects whether crime goes up or down. So some quick examples about overclaiming, right? Glasgow, once the murder capital, now it's a model for cutting crime. But a great cautionary thing here, researchers urge caution in assessing the impact. Stress the difficulty of pinpointing and disentangling the variables that influence crime rates. This was a case where they, did a job training program for ex-cons. Recidivism went down, crime rate went down, but they're very honest here. It seems to have had some impact, but be aware lots of things can impact it. Similarly, this is to me, just the perfect example of being cautious and not overclaiming. This was early on during COVID. LA Times does a story, kills some people, hardly affects others. What can we figure out from that? One thing that this is high in the story, one thing to keep in mind before we continue, it's possible the information you read below will be contradicted in the coming weeks. So it's like we're going to tell you a bunch of stuff. Be aware we might be wrong. It might be totally contradicted, before the month is out. So yeah, careful not to overclaim, be open about limitations. So be transparent about what you don't know. This is, kind of related to that. Again, with COVID, Utah and New Mexico, were really good with COVID-19 testing. And there were some things that they did, you can see at the bottom here, 2 important assets that they brought to bear that appear to be playing a part. But even before they get to here's what sets Utah and New Mexico apart, they have a great cautionary line in the above, that this expert they talked to, that some of it probably has to do with factors outside of the state's control. So again, being very transparent about the limitations of your evidence and also simply what you don't know. All right, the value of graphics to present data. This is out of California. A lot of women were bleeding to death in childbirth. The state put in a new protocols statewide in hospitals. And, in an instant, your brain registers what's going on with this data. The country as a whole is, doing this after 2008, this sort of string of record highs, and California just completely bucks that trend and goes in the opposite direction. That, the way our visual brains work, that gets that point across in a way that words just won't. That really just sort of hits right to the brain. And then lastly, remembering that correlation is not causation. The fact that 2 things happen at the same time doesn't necessarily mean that they're related. I'm hoping this video is playing on your screens. This extremely strong man stopping a train on his own. I love that he goes back for some chalk. And Mr. Muscleman, quick push here. And off he sends the train on its way and is very pleased with himself. So, yes, correlation is not causation. No, sorry. There we go. This is my favorite nerdy comic of all time. So that is my final thought on this. Thanks for listening. I think the last slide asks for questions, which will open it up, but I will leave the very last slide on for a minute if people want to take down my or Nicole's contact information. Always happy to answer questions, help out with stories, help out with data at any time going forward. So feel free to reach out, and I'll stop sharing in a minute, make sure people have time for that so we can all see each other. And we are open for questions. Someone asked about emailing the slides. I believe we are making that available.
Yes, we'll share this recording with everybody and as well as the presentation with everyone, including a survey for feedback after the session is over. So.
All right. So questions. As one of my colleagues says, I've always liked this, I welcome feedback and pushback. So if you have questions or you want to challenge something, I'm all ears. And since you are all journalists, and journalists are not shy, don't feel like, oh, well, I'm not sure if I want to ask that question. Ask away. We are journalists. That's what we do. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now.
I have a question for you. Yeah. When it comes to approaching like trying to find solutions stories, is there a good like methodology or kind of technique to apply or approach to apply to making sure that your story does have evidence? I guess that we come across this a lot with some stories where we'll get stories where they're about a really good program, but the evidence is not as strong. So is there any kind of, when you're at the very beginning and just kind of looking at potential stories before you actually start working on them, what are some good tips to do to make sure?
So I would say if it's in an area that, you know, it might make sense for someone somewhere, kind of almost no matter how, you know, niche or remote, to have looked into, you know, we say you're like never supposed to make assumptions in journalism. Like I'll let you make one assumption that like there is information, relevant information and evidence out there somewhere. It might be hiding in an academic report somewhere. It might be in some obscure you know, government database. But if you feel like this has probably been looked into, you know, then really sort of charge ahead. And some of the things that we did here, again, sort of on the academic research side, are there organizations that are interested in this area? You know, is there a magazine that covers this general topic? Are there people I could reach out to find out, you know, might there be some evidence around this, some earlier, you know, reporting or consideration of? I often say in reporting, like if you're trying to find some information or if some information exists and you don't know, you know, who has it, think about, well, who would know who I could reach out to? And if you can't think of that, then, you know, take it one step back, as many steps, you know, who would know someone I could talk to get a lead on someone who might know, you know, and all that. So, but certainly, you know, do sort of that early reporting that you would do. Is there, Google's frankly great with data. You know, you can search Google to show just spreadsheets, just adding type :XLSX, and it will only return spreadsheets. So if you're looking into a topic and wondering, you know, on the quantitative side, is there some data on this? Try that, you know, LexisNexis or other aggregators of news sources. Have there been news stories written about this? You know, Google Scholar can get you into academic work that there might have been a topic on. And then if you're writing about something where there are participants in it, right? That's where we saw on foster care. I know very little about foster care, but if I were, you know, talking to someone, a child in the system, or, you know, someone at the government level involved in it, talk to them. Where can I find this? You work with this all the time. You know, can you point me in the direction of some place where there might be not simply people that can talk about it, but like some real evidence, you know, that's going to support sort of the story I'm trying to work on.
I think Rosie has her hand raised.
Yes.
Rosie, if you want to unmute.
Sorry, my internet connection says it's stable. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So my question is, how do you present the data so that it's easy to understand? I'm not a numbers person, and I've seen some excellent solutions journalism stories, but I've kind of gotten turned off by the data because it was so complicated and there was so much of it. So I didn't even look at the data, I just read the story. And so, does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. There was, I believe it was at the Wall Street Journal, they had an editor there, I don't know if he or she is still there, that basically had like a hard rule that you cannot have more than, it was either 1 or 2 numbers in a paragraph, because people will just zone out. It's just sort of too much. So, you know, what we talked about, using graphics, right? Move data into graphics whenever you can. In the text, you know, particularly if you have graphics to go with it, you don't need to say.
I was actually referring to the graphics.
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Talking about in the text where, yeah.
No, the graphics were so, it was overwhelming. There were so many different charts.
Got it. Okay. Yes. Right. If you're talking about sort of a, the word salad equivalent, like the chart I showed of all the countries, that was way too much to show in a chart, right? That was for the purpose of showing, wow, look how these sort of stand out here. Yeah. I would say be the reader, right? Or viewer, or I guess not listener with visual graphics. As you put something together, say, is this too much? And what is it that I really am trying to say? And does this say it? And if it's overwhelming, then it's sort of like anything else that, when you're writing and you have something that is like impossibly complicated or is, 6,000 words and you just know no one's going to get to the end of it. It's like, then that's not sort of ultimately helpful there. I would say with graphics, avoid graphics that have a vertical axis on both sides. Sometimes people will sort of combine two different charts and, one part of it relies on the, y-axis on the left and the other, the y-axis on the right. That can be difficult for people to comprehend. And if you're doing, say, a line chart, certainly be careful about how many lines there are. And then last, I'd say, be really conscious of the type of chart that you've chosen. Different charts sort of serve different purposes. A bar chart or a column chart is great when you're trying to sort of show the relative size of different things. That works very well if you have two vertical bars next to each other. You can kind of see, okay, this is bigger than this, and I can see, and it's like 3 times bigger, that works. If you're very much doing sort of parts of the whole, a pie chart can be better than a bar chart, particularly if there's sort of one element that really, really stands out. And it's like, oh, wow, there are all these elements here, but yeah, I can see this one takes up, 40% of the whole pie. That sort of will stand out there. So not too much in your chart, and pick the right chart. I'd say would be my quick answers to that.
We have a couple more. We have Brittany, then Sophie, then Katarzyna. So Brittany, would you like to go first?
Sure. So this might be a little bit, I don't know if you'd be able to answer this, but so I'm a meteorologist. So a lot of the stories I do are about like local weather and climate change and things like that. And I don't know if it's obviously the same, because I know we have people from other countries here, but climate change is just such a still highly politicized, I think, topic in the US. So do you have any advice on how to frame, I guess, a story for people that maybe already don't believe like in at all, or in the human influence?
Yeah, so this actually comes up a lot, and often, specifically with climate change, and with COVID. And what I urge people to do, and it can be a little uncomfortable, is like, you've applied your news judgment to the stories that you write about. You've decided, I find this is credible and accurate, and I'm going to run with it. And so sort of advice number one is don't pull punches there. If you are scientifically satisfied, this is a real issue, and there are people who think differently, but my expertise and my news judgment says they are wrong, then don't shy away from doing those stories. I think you could throw in kind of a quick line saying, while the topic remains controversial, it is, the overwhelming opinion of scientific experts in the field that blank. And I'd say just sort of leave it at that. Don't make it he said, she said. You don't have to give equal time to a side that, in your, unbiased expert opinion, kind of doesn't deserve that equal time, right? It's your story. If your news judgment says, this is what I think is appropriate, stick with it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great. Sophie, you're next.
Hello, Sophie. Sophie is one of our Sojo champions, but she is muted. No, you're still muted.
Oh, muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you. I learned a lot, so thank you so much. Data, yes, is a big challenge for us, and it will be regarding climate change. So I have a question regarding this. We see with the COP26 that many states say, hey, I'll be carbon neutral by 2030, by 2050, by 2060. So we're going to have a lot of data coming. But how, as a journalist, can we check really the numbers? We have organizations who work on that. In our country, we have a good organization, but it's not the case in every country. So how can we work on that data in the future regarding these greenhouses and the state plan? Any advices on that, Matthew?
I mean, that's a tough one, right? Because that does require sort of that high level of expertise. And I would say if your newsroom doesn't have it, I'd go back to something I said earlier about, with academic research, there's often a whole lot of money available in academic research so that researchers can take the time and have a whole team of students helping them out and the like, and just have resources that a newsroom does not have, and also quite possibly decades of experience in the topic. This is sort of their moment, but they may have been studying it for ages. So if there were a way maybe to partner with a university researcher, as long as you're satisfied that they don't have an inappropriate agenda there, that might help, because that is an awful lot of sophisticated analysis. It'd be great to have some expertise on your side. And university researchers, I think, are usually thrilled that people are interested in their work and are happy to help.
Thank you so much. Good advice. Thank you, Matthew.
And Katarzyna?
Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. What in the case that our data or our evidences are, we don't have much of them, and this what we have are somehow related. So this is the problem that I had recently. I was working on the solution journalism stories on a particular technology involving plants. So the company who invented this said they've got researchers. It was made by one of the universities. I got it, of course, and then I was looking for an independent researcher who's interested in the same field or very similar field. And it turned out that this is a niche, and this is a niche within a niche. So I managed to find only one person in the whole country that was doing, that was interested exactly in this topic. And later it turned out that he was also doing research for this company. It was not this research that I got, but later they cooperate with each other.
Yeah.
So what in this case, and if I ask, okay, maybe there were similar researchers doing abroad, and answer was, well, unfortunately, it's so new and so small that really maybe Chinese did something similar, but it's not exactly the same.
Yeah.
What in this case?
Right. So in niche areas, even in not terribly niche areas, right, they're often a sort of fairly limited number of people involved in it. We see this actually in the drug approval process in the United States, where experts will come in for the presentation, and every last one of them will be on the speakers bureau for a drug company, that one or a competing one, or, it's sort of what they do. Kind of everyone has a conflict there, and we all sort of cross our fingers that they're, looking at things dispassionately and objectively. I think in a case like that, if it's a complicated area where it's not like, hey, give me the data, let me do my independent analysis. If it's sort of, more complicated than that, then you're kind of at the mercy of the company. You can sort of, ask questions about how was it, compiled, were there any problems with it, and the like, to sort of try to, see if there's any reason to be particularly cautious. But beyond that, I think what you do is you are simply transparent about it. You say, the company provided, the research, so-and-so looked it over, though, he also does have an involvement with the company. Sort of that, transparency doesn't eliminate a conflict, but it at least puts your audience, on notice that they should be considering it cautiously, just as you're considering it cautiously. And hey, if 5 years later it all, blows up in their face, then you've got a good follow-up story and can ask, well, what was with your data from before? So.
All right, our last question will be from Elena. If you want to unmute.
Well, it's not a question, it's just a small comment related to the statistics or to the chart, the death rate of the, the water-related deaths. So just for your information, my husband just looked up that in the middle, that really the statistics seem to be good, the chart, because my husband just looked up that in the middle of 2014, the government imposed some stricter regulations, drinking water regulations. So it's probably correct. So, but we really live in a so-called water luxury. And the problem here is to be more economical and save drinking water and not just to not to use it to flush toilets and use gray water and harvest rainwater, etc., etc. But thank you.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
So that's
that was
great.
just for background. Thank you.
I find that fascinating. That indeed it may well be that that data, pointed us to information we didn't know about before that might actually have been a response that's turned out successful. So maybe there's a story in the offing there.
I will encourage, just one more comment, I will encourage my students to try and really spread solutions related to blue-green infrastructure, and again, the rainwater usage and all of that. So yes, but thank you for the seminar. Lovely.
All right, thank you.
And I'll share the recording with my students.
Great.
Yeah, and actually before we go, is Richard here?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so Richard is he's not Matthew Kaufman. He's one of the, but he's from an organization actually that could help with some of these issues too. So if you want to take just one moment to talk about
Sure.
before we leave.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so hello everyone. I'm not a journalist, never have been, but I'm a big supporter of journalism. So as a volunteer, I work in the area of freedom of information, and specifically in the Czech Republic. I'm one of a group that has launched the Czech version of an online website which enables easy deployment of freedom of information to authorities. It's a British platform. It's called alavatelli.org, and they have websites in, I think now 26 countries, which you can find on their website.
Can you type it in the chat?
Sorry? Yeah,
can you put
sure.
the URL in the chat for people?
Yep. The reason why the websites are so useful for journalists especially is that the alternative is you have to find out which authority you want to make the request to, you have to find out their address, and you have to approach them directly. But only you and they know what happens to your correspondence. And for ordinary members of the public, at least, that's a big disadvantage. And these websites shed a light of transparency on the actual freedom of information process. And it's been very successfully used by a lot of people around the world. However, there's a potential disadvantage of this for journalists, which is that I think in many countries there's a small community of journalists who kind of know a lot of each other, and they might actually, one journalist might see another journalist's question and start to wonder, okay, what story is it that this person's pursuing here? So recently Alavatelli has launched Alavatelli Pro, which solves that problem for journalists. It means that if you're making a request through Pro, you can keep that invisible to other users of the website as and when you feel ready to show it publicly, if ever. And that's, I think it's being gradually rolled out. We've got it in the Czech Republic. It started in Great Britain, and the good news is that at least for the foreseeable future in most jurisdictions, it'll be free to use. All you need to do is contact the administrators of the website, and they'll fix you up with it. But hopefully, I think generally FOI is a good source of evidence. We've seen our super user in the Czech Republic was a data journalist who was basically posing the same question to sometimes hundreds of different authorities looking for discrepancies amongst their answers, and his story was found in that nugget that the discrepancies showed up, and he's got several examples of that which went on TV before he sadly left the industry. He now works, I think, for a private organization making commercial investigations. Anyway, that's basically what I just wanted to introduce you all to, and hopefully some of you might find it useful somewhere along the line.
So if you have any questions, or feel free to reach out to me or Matthew, and we hope you enjoyed this.